Jenny was returning home after a long day at work, the road stretching ahead of her like a ribbon in the darkness. She had been driving for hours, her eyes heavy when her gas light blinked on. With a sigh, she scanned the road, hoping for a gas station. After a few miles, she finally saw one, a lone, dimly lit station on the side of the highway, its neon sign flickering weakly. Pulling into the empty lot, Jenny felt a strange unease settle over her. The place looked deserted, as if it hadn't been used in years. She almost decided to leave, but reminded herself that she really needed the fuel to get home. With a deep breath, she stepped out of her car, glancing around nervously. There were no other cars, no sounds except the distant hum of the fluorescent lights, and no attendant in sight. Jenny approached the pump, trying to shake off the strange feeling. As she started filling her tank, she noticed a figure standing at the far edge of the lot, partially hidden in the shadows. She could barely make out the outline, but it looked like someone was watching her. Being heart racing, she quickly averted her gaze, telling herself it was just her imagination. When she glanced back a moment later, the figure was gone. Just as her tank finished filling, Jenny heard a faint noise. She whipped around, but there was no one there. Her skin prickled, and she quickly put the pump back, heading for the station's tiny convenience store to pay. The door creaked as she stepped inside, the smell of stale air and cleaning chemicals hitting her immediately. The interior was dimly lit with shelves lined with dusty snacks and drinks. A small, flickering TV on the counter played static, adding an eerie ambiance to the already unsettling atmosphere. Jenny approached the counter, tapping the little bell. She rang it again, louder this time, but there was still no response. Frustrated, she called out,
"Hello? Anyone here?"
She could just make out a dark doorway behind the counter, leading into what looked like a storage room. She waited, hoping someone would appear, but the room remained silent. Growing uneasy, she decided to leave cash on the counter and just go. She took a step back, but then a faint scratching noise came from the back room, making her freeze. The scratching grew louder, closer, as if something was crawling toward her from the dark. Her heart pounded as she tried to convince herself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon trapped inside. But as the sound grew, it became clear it was something more, something slow, deliberate, almost human. Suddenly, the faint outline of a shadow appeared in the doorway, moving closer to the counter. Jenny's throat tightened as she watched, unable to move. The shadow paused at the edge of the doorway, then began to shift, elongating, as if something was trying to force its way through. The flickering TV suddenly switched to a loud, blaring static, filling the room with an unbearable noise. Panicked, Jenny backed away, her eyes glued to the shadow that seemed to grow taller and darker with each passing second. Finally, she forced herself to turn and run out of the store, her footsteps echoing in the empty lot as she made a dash for her car. But as she reached her vehicle, her heart dropped. Standing by her car door was the same figure she'd seen earlier, now fully visible under the station's weak lights. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face pale and eyes sunken. He wore a dirty mechanic's uniform, and his lips stretched into a strange, unnatural smile. The man tilted his head, watching her with a gaze that sent chills down her spine. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stared, as if waiting for her to make a move. Jenny felt trapped, the gas station and highway suddenly feeling like a prison. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. But the man blocked her only escape route. Just then, the lights around the station began to flicker, plunging everything into darkness for a brief moment before flashing back on. In that split second, the man had moved closer, his expression even more unsettling. His mouth opened slightly, and Jenny could hear the faintest whispering sound, like hundreds of voices murmuring just beneath his breath. With a burst of adrenaline, she fumbled for her car keys, gripping them like a weapon.
"Stay away from me!"
she shouted, her voice shaking. The man didn't react. He simply tilted his head, as if studying her. Then, in a chillingly slow movement, he raised a hand and pointed toward the station's convenience store, his gaze never leaving her. Jenny glanced over her shoulder toward the store and felt her stomach drop. Through the grimy window, she could see something moving inside, pacing back and forth, occasionally pausing to stare directly at her through the glass. Whatever it was tall and thin, with long claw like fingers scraping against the window. Has it moved? Frozen in terror, she looked back at the man who now wore a sinister grin, his eyes gleaming with some sick amusement. He lowered his arm, but before she could react, the lights went out again, plunging everything into darkness. And this time, when they flickered back on, the man was gone, leaving her alone in the lot. Jenny wasted no time. She jumped into her car, locked the doors, and started the engine, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. But as she put the car in reverse, she heard a soft tapping on her window. She turned, expecting the worst, but there was nothing there, just her own fright. She backed out of the lot and sped down the highway, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. For miles, she saw nothing, and she began to think she'd escaped. But just as she started to relax, the radio in her car crackled to life, static filling the speakers. Over the noise, a faint, chilling voice whispered her name.
Jenny?
Panicked, she reached to turn off the radio, but the static only grew louder, the voice becoming more distinct. Jenny, come back. We're waiting. The hairs on her arms stood on end as she recognized the voice. It was the man from the gas station. She slammed her foot on the gas, desperate to outrun the haunting words. As she drove, the voice faded, replaced by a faint scratching noise coming from her back seat. She didn't dare look but could feel an icy presence filling the car. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the wheel, heart racing, every instinct screaming at her to keep driving and not look back. Finally, she reached the outskirts of her town, the familiar streetlights giving her a sense of safety. She pulled into her driveway, breathing a sigh of relief. But when she glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, her heart sank. There in the faint reflection was the man's face, grinning at her from the back seat. Jenny sped away from the eerie gas station, haunted by whispers on her radio calling her name. Relief hit as she reached home, but a scratching from her back seat sent chills through her. She dared not look, gripping the wheel tighter, hoping the nightmare was over. Finally parked in her driveway, she glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart stopping as she saw the man's ghostly grin staring back from the shadows. In the dead of night, along an empty stretch of highway, a lone gas station glowed dimly, its flickering neon sign the only sign of life for miles. Jack had been driving for hours, exhausted, fighting to stay awake. He was in desperate need of gas and a break, so when he spotted this station, he pulled over, relieved for a chance to rest. As he parked, the silence around him became unsettling. There were no other cars, no attendants, just his own car and the endless blackness beyond the station's faint lights. When he stepped out of the car, a cold gust of wind sent a chill through him. He looked around, expecting someone to appear, but he was alone. The windows of the small station building were dark, and a faint buzzing sound came from the neon sign that spelled in irregular half-lit letters. Something about the place felt wrong, but he shrugged it off, assuming it was just his exhaustion. He walked to the pump and started filling his tank, glancing around every so often. As he waited, he noticed a strange smell like burnt rubber mixed with something metallic. He tried to ignore it, but it was overpowering, making him cough. Just then, he heard a soft, scraping noise coming from the other side of the pump. His heart raced as he leaned around to look, but there was nothing there. Trying to convince himself it was just his tired mind playing tricks, he turned back to his car, only to find that his gas tank was already full, though it hadn't been a moment ago. Confused, Jack put the nozzle back, glancing nervously at the dark windows of the station building. Something moved behind the glass, a shadow flitting across the room. He froze, his eyes fixed on the spot, but the shadow didn't appear again. Trying to shake off the feeling, he went inside to pay. The bell above the door chimed weakly as he entered, and a rush of cold air followed him. The station was eerily empty. with shelves stocked with dusty, old snacks, and the air felt stale, like the place hadn't been open in years. Approaching the counter, he tapped the bell, but there was no response. A faint dripping sound echoed through the room. As he waited, he noticed a faint stain on the counter, dark and dried, like old blood. He recoiled, looking around for any sign of the attendant, but the place was dead silent. The dripping sound grew louder, echoing from somewhere in the back. His curiosity got the better of him, and he moved toward the sound, walking down a narrow hallway toward a door that said employees only. The smell of burnt rubber returned, stronger this time, mixed with an unmistakable metallic tang. He hesitated, glancing back at the empty station, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling him forward. Slowly, he pushed the door open and peered inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow from the station's neon sign seeping through a dirty window. In the center of the room was a large stain on the floor, and from the ceiling, a thin rope hung, swinging gently as if recently disturbed. Jack's heart pounded as he took a step back, horrified by the eerie scene. That's when he heard the door to the station creak open behind him. Turning quickly, he expected to see anyone, but the station remained empty. He felt a sudden chill, the temperature dropping drastically as he looked around. The shelves seemed to cast long, distorted shadows that stretched toward him. Then he heard the scraping sound again, this time coming from the hallway he'd just come through. It was getting louder, closer, as if something was dragging itself along the floor. Panicking, Jack rushed back down the hallway toward the main room, only to stop dead in his tracks. The figure he'd glimpsed through the station window earlier was standing by the counter, staring directly at him. It was a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and skin stretched tight over a skeletal face. Its clothes were old and tattered, and it held a gas can in one hand, slowly dripping with a dark, oily liquid. Jack's instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The figure tilted its head, a sickening smile creeping across its face as it raised the gas can, tipping it so that the dark liquid began to pool at its feet. The smell of gasoline filled the air, overpowering, and Jack realized with horror that the liquid wasn't just gas. It was mixed with something thicker, darker, that clung to the floor as it spread. Finally snapping out of his paralysis, Jack bolted toward the door, but the figure moved fast, blocking his path. Desperate, Jack darted down an aisle, knocking over shelves as he went. He could hear the footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate, and he knew that the figure was toying with him, letting him run but never giving him a chance to escape. He stumbled, falling to the floor, and when he looked up, the figure was standing over him, its hollow eyes empty yet somehow filled with malice. In a desperate attempt to escape, Jack grabbed a nearby can of lighter fluid. It only grinned wider, seemingly unfazed, and Jack realized too late that the figure had been soaked in gasoline the entire time. In a final act of horror, the figure struck a match, the small flame illuminating its ghastly face for an instant before everything went up in flames. Jack scrambled backward as the fire spread, filling the small station with smoke and heat. He ran for the door, bursting out into the cold night air, coughing and gasping, his mind reeling from what he'd just seen. As he looked back, he saw the gas station engulfed in flames, but there was no sign of the figure. The windows shattered, the flames casting eerie shadows across the empty highway. Shaken, Jack stumbled to his car, desperate to leave. But when he tried to start the engine, it sputtered and died. In a panic, he glanced back at the burning station, only to see a figure standing just outside the flames, staring at him with hollow eyes. Its skeletal grin was still visible through the smoke, and it slowly raised its hand, pointing directly at him. Jack's blood ran cold as he realized the figure wasn't bound to the gas station. It was coming for him. With trembling hands, he tried the ignition again, and this time, the engine roared to life. He sped off down the empty highway, never looking back, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. Every so often he'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those hollow eyes staring back at him from the darkness. The smell of burnt rubber and gasoline lingered in his car, a haunting reminder that no matter how far he drove, he couldn't escape what he'd seen. Jack drove through the night, his heart racing and his eyes darting to the rearview mirror with every passing mile. The highway seemed endless, stretching on as if mocking his attempts to escape. Just when he began to believe he was safe, his headlights caught a figure standing by the side of the road, a skeletal face with hollow eyes staring directly at him, the same horrifying grin splitting its face. Jack's breath hitched as he sped past, but even as he rounded a bend, the figure appeared again, closer now in the middle of the road, pointing right at him. In desperation, Jack pressed the pedal to the floor, yet no matter how fast he went, the figure kept reappearing, inching closer each time, haunting every shadow. Finally, his car began to sputter, the engine giving out in an ominous final breath. Trapped on the empty road, Jack could only watch in terror as the figure approached, its hollow eyes locking onto him with a dark, unbreakable stare. As the last bit of light vanished, Jack knew there would be no escape. He was the gas station's newest ghostly inhabitant.